I think one of the most important parts of the book is, I think it's 1969. You're just sitting in the office one day, and Jesse Daniels' mother, Pearl Daniels, walks into the office, and I just find that one of the most powerful scenes. Like, finally, something may be getting done. She's run to the right person. What was that like? What are your memories of that?
Well, I mean, you portrayed it great in the book because that's about the way it was. I was a little skeptical at first, but I was anxious. I mean, it was such an exciting sounding thing that I was hoping that I could do something, if it were real, that I could do something to help. And so I had to find out if it's real. And
Right.
I called the lawyer in Lake County who had been working on it and who had just about lost his practice because of the pressure put on him there. And so talked to him, and he assured me he was innocent.
Right.
Yeah, and then I talked to Mabel Chesley, who by that time she was working in Daytona for the News Journal.
Right.
And I called her, and she gave me a very passionate accounting of how bad it was.
Right.
So I said, I got to do something about this.
And so Mabel, this was basically her crusade. She'd been working on this case by this time for about 12 years.
Right.
She'd basically been run out of Lake County by the powers that be, the same powers that you were going to find yourself going up against very shortly. But Mabel was a great crusader, and she was also friends with Pearl. And so I just thought it was interesting that, Mabel's the one who sort of put Pearl up to going in to see you. And then now we have, you're sort of teaming up with Mabel. And looking into this case. And I mean, how did the case strike you? You talked about calling Tom Champion in Lake County to find out how it ruined his career. But how did it, appeal to you? I mean, obviously you did believe that Jesse was innocent at some point.
I did. I believed it fairly quickly because, particularly with Champion, he said he was railroaded. Yeah. And he said, Mabel is not going to let it go. She's not going to quit until she gets him declared innocent. She was something.
Yeah, she was a force, and obviously she had a really close friendship with Pearl Daniels. And what was your impression of Pearl Daniels when she walked out? Do you think she had hope that you were going to take this case, or do you think it was just another stop in her life?
I think she had hope because I told her that I would immediately call Tom Champion and Mabel Chesley. And both of those were very favorable to the case of Jesse Daniels.
Right.
And so I called her up and said, we'll take it.
And there was something with the legal aid, I guess, charter or mission that they don't take criminal cases.
Right.
So what did you have to do to get involved with this case?
Well, I probably didn't even know about that restriction because I don't think it was written. I think it was just an oral thing. But there were other disagreements too. At that time, legal service, when it first started, the OEO let the Volusia County Bar Association pretty much control it by being they appointed the entire board. And OEO grew to not like that at all because they were very conservative, and they wanted us to do divorce cases and stuff. They were all lawyers. If they had a friend that needed a divorce, that didn't have any money, they'd send them to us.
Right.
And that's what they wanted us to do. And the OEO wanted us to do impact cases, challenge the constitutionality of statutes and things like that, which is what I wanted to do.
Right.
So ended up just, and then I found out about the prohibition in criminal cases. And so I left and went back to my father's firm.
Right. And so now you're talking about bringing in a pro bono case to your father's firm.
Right.
How'd that go over?
Better than I had expected. I made it as a condition of coming back. And at that time, I don't know why, but I was getting offers from a lot of law firms. Oh, wow. And so I said, I want to come here, but I can't leave this case here because no one will handle it over there.
Right.
And so I've got to bring it with me. And I told them, we had to have expert witnesses and stuff. And I didn't have any money. I just got out of Army basic training. And the firm had a meeting, and I was there. And, they asked me if he was innocent. I said, I really believe he is. And Ted Husfeld was at the meeting. He was the one that convinced the rest of them, no problem. Well, if he's innocent, we should do it.
Right. And Ted had a lot more experience than you at the time.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
He was, I could not have done this case without him.
Right, right.
And I couldn't have done it without the firm's, financing it. I didn't,
Right.
So it was just such a pleasure to work with Ted Husfeld. I learned a lot from him, and he was the hardest worker I've ever seen.
And what was his specialty of law at the time?
He did a lot of medical. We had a lot of insurance claim cases, and it always involved medical doctors fighting and everything. One says, "Oh, he's hurt really bad," and the other one says, "It's nothing. He's faking." So, so Ted knew. I mean, he had a skeleton and everything, and he could go into court and stand right up to those doctors, and and he loved that, and that he did a lot of that. But and he did some other corporate work, but that was his real specialty.
One of my favorite stories in the book, and this is one that you told me, because otherwise a lot of this research would not exist unless you told me about these stories, because it really wasn't documented anywhere. But one of my favorite stories was you had gotten an order in order to look at Jesse Daniels' medical records at Chattahoochee. And as soon as you got that order signed, Ted had some words of advice. What were they?
We presented the order. We drove to Tavares and got the presiding judge because we had an order from the Supreme Court that we could have another hearing in the circuit court in Lake County on the question of whether Jesse was competent, could understand the charges, and could assist his attorney in the trial. And so after that, we got the judge to sign the order. We went to the clerk's office and got it certified.
Right, right.
And so then we were walking out, and Ted said, "Get in the car." We'd driven over together, and I said, "Where are we going?" He said, "Chattahoochee." And I said, "Now?" And he said, "Those records won't be there tomorrow."
So Ted seemed to be a little bit familiar with things that maybe you weren't familiar with.
He knew more about Lake County politics and corruption than I'd ever even dreamed about.
Right. And how would you compare, having spent your life in Volusia, what was it like dealing with Lake County all of a sudden? Was it like a sudden education about certain parts of Florida?
It was amazing to me because they're right across the St. Johns River from where I lived, and I'd never seen anything like the corruption in the state attorney's office, the sheriff's office. These are people who are elected state officials. They're supposed to help poor people and innocent people, and here they go enter into a great big conspiracy to ruin the life of a family just so a lady could not be said to have been raped by a black man.
Right. I mean, when you explain that story to people, and I think what's really interesting is I've met a lot of people who knew you and who knew you well, and they said, "I didn't know that Dick Graham was involved in that case." I mean, was there a reason that it just wasn't part of your biography?
Well, that's one reason, but the other is no one would have believed it, what we saw. And that's what made me so happy when I heard you were writing it, because I think you researched 6 years, didn't you?
About that, yeah.
And I didn't think anybody would do that.
Well, the more, it's like one of those cases, the more you dig into it, the more interesting it gets.
Right.
And I'm sure you experienced this, but I had a lot of moments like, "Oh, you're kidding me. That's what happened next? I can't believe this is happening." And I had to double check and triple check everything. And so, yeah, you're right. It was a hard thing. People don't believe it when they hear it.
Yeah.
It sounds like a novel rather than nonfiction sometimes.
Particularly the blatant racism. I mean, the part of the book that didn't involve Jesse Daniels and certainly Devil in the Grove, it's just a pattern of brutality toward the Negroes.
Right. Right. And that was a big part of Lake County under the Sheriff Willis McCall, who we're going to definitely talk about by the end of this conversation.
Good.
But there's another great moment, I think, in this story When you initially start out, you're working on Jesse's case, and you're met with some resistance already in Lake County, and you try to appeal it, take it to the Florida Supreme Court, doesn't work. But then you had some encouragement from the Florida Supreme Court.
Right. In Florida, anyway, you can file a petition for writ of habeas corpus in any level of the judiciary in the state. So I said, well, why would we go to Lake County? We just went to Tallahassee and filed in the state Supreme Court.
Right.
And so they took the case and ordered a hearing, and the hearing was before the Supreme Court. That's where, I had a hard time. I presented the oral argument for Jesse, and I was getting real critical questions from particularly Justice B.K. Roberts, but a couple of the others too. So I said, well, we're not going to be winning this case, not in this court. And so later on, I didn't know, I never knew until I read the book, actually, that that Justice Irwin, who was Chief Justice, he'd been Attorney General for the state of Florida 10 years before when Jesse's event happened. A person in law enforcement, I can't recall his name now, but I would.
Right, the Leesburg Chief of Police, Fisher.
Yeah,
Bill Fisher.
That's it. He had gone up to Tallahassee, and when they were holding Jesse, and he told him he did not do it. He is innocent. And he even told him who he thought did do it. That's Sam Wiley Odom,
right,
who had the death penalty against him at the time for raping someone else, I think.
Right.
And so I didn't have any idea of that connection. And so in your book, you said, I was feeling too rough about the case because of B.K. Roberts and others.
Right.
And you said, I had no way of knowing about Fisher going up to see Justice Irwin, but you said there's very little chance he'd forgotten it.
Yeah, I mean, it must have made a difference because at one point, I think you were calling to check in on the decision, and you got an unlikely answer on the end of the phone.
Right. Yeah, Pearl came in to see me. Christmas was coming up, and we hadn't heard, and so she asked me if I would call. I would never call a judge. Right. That's a no-no for a lawyer to do that about a case. But I called just the office, and he didn't answer it, but all of a sudden can you hold a minute? And he gets on. Wow. So he initiated the conversation.
Wow. And
they had just ruled the day before or something. We didn't have the opinion yet. So he said, I'm sorry to tell you this, but we ruled against you. And it was a 4-1 decision. He wrote a dissent, right, and he thought that the Supreme Court of Florida should hear the case, and we challenged the constitutionality of the involuntary commitment statute and some other things, the quality of the indictment that they got, and he wanted to hear both of them, the law and the facts, but so he wrote that dissent. But right before we hung up, he said, I want to tell you something. You're right and we're wrong, and I hope you won't stop here.
Yeah, that's got to be encouraging for you, even though you lost that decision.
Yeah, that was very encouraging. Yeah.
But then you did something that was, you went right to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right. That's another little research that I did that I didn't know about, in law school or anything else. But if you challenge the constitutionality of a state statute on the basis of federal constitutional violations, and you lose it in the highest court in the state you're in, you have a direct appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. You don't have to go to the other federal courts. You start at the top. We did the same thing in the state. So that was one of the quicker cases I've ever heard of getting to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right.
And so we filed it, and they actually took the case later on, and they really, in a way that how they're feeling. they told the attorney general to tell him pretty much why they shouldn't void the statute and let him go.
Right. And that must have sent shockwaves into the state of Florida, because
It
now
did.
they know that this is on the radar of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right. And after it was over, I asked one of the top guys in the attorney general's office, how do you think the court would have ruled? He said, we knew how the court was going to rule. It was going to be 9-0 against us.
Wow, really?
And that was the tone of that order that they sent.
That is really interesting.
But we didn't get a chance to take it to a final judgment there because we won it in the state court before we got there.
And there was somebody back in Daytona who was very excited to hear about this news, and that was Mabel.
Yes.
She wrote a big story about the Supreme Court showing interest in this case, and also this bright, talented young lawyer who's taken on Jesse's case.
Yeah, she was very happy. She talked him into putting it on the front page.
Yeah.
And making a big story out of it. It was a big story, really, because as you said in the book, it's the third case coming out of Okahumpka,
Yeah.
a town of 300 people that ended in the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, I bet Miami hadn't had 3.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any legal landscape like that in the entire country. This town's about the size of a couple football fields.
Right.
A couple hundred people, and there's 3 separate civil rights cases that all make it to the U.S. Supreme Court, all with Sheriff Willis McCall's footprint all over it.
Absolutely.
Right. So Mabel writes this great story, and I mean, what was that like? Mabel's reputation was this agitator. She had a nickname, Red Mabel, because she took to leftist issues. And what was that like among your friends and family to know that you're now working side by side with Red Mabel?
Yeah, I got some comments about it, and they'd ask me what I was doing hanging out with her, and I told them, I'm just trying to get an innocent guy out of a nut house.
Right, right. And at the time, I mean, were you aware of the reputation of Chattahoochee at the time?
I'd heard about it, but my first trip up there, and that was when we took the court order up there and got the records.
Right.
That was the first time I knew how bad it was. I heard it was awful. It's way worse than Rayford.
Right.
I mean, they put him in a criminal ward because he had charges.
Right.
No convictions or anything, just charges. And he couldn't go outside. He hadn't gone outside since he'd been there. And this is 10 years later.
10 years at least, yeah.
Maybe 12. And just nothing. His mother described it as you eat and you sleep and they don't do anything to help your mind. And of course, Jesse's descriptions were, ongoing about it. He on one of his interviews, he said there wasn't a day he was there he wouldn't mind dying.
Yeah. Well, you can't imagine what kind of life he led behind those walls. Can you just talk about what it was like? I mean, you went up there to get the records, Jesse's records, but you also met him. What was it like the first time you saw him?
Well, he was very humble and polite, and he was very glad that he had a lawyer that was doing something.
Right.
And, but it was sad that he was, I think he was cuffed. It's been a long time, but I know he was coming from a locked part of the thing. He couldn't, no way to escape it.
Right.
So that's Rayford, except maybe not. Rayford's a little easier because they let us go outside anyway.
Yeah, I think they might have been safer at Rayford. A lot of people said later that if you had your choice between Chattahoochee and Rayford, you wanted to take Rayford because Chattahoochee was just bad. And
it was.
I remember talking to a lot of people when I was doing research, and the same story comes up. If kids were misbehaving, the mother would say something, you better watch yourself, you're gonna end up at Chattahoochee. And I mean, I don't think anyone had ever been to Chattahoochee. It just had this reputation in Florida. Yeah,
that was the first time I'd seen it. I'd heard about it, particularly in law school. They talked about how bad the prison system was, and this is worse than the prison system.
Right. So now you've started this whole process. You've gone up to Chattahoochee. You're looking through the files. What was your strategy? What was the legal strategy behind Jesse's case?
Well, to get him out for sure and have him declared innocent. And if we did that, get him compensated for what they did to him intentionally.
Right. And you ran into resistance at every single level, at every single hearing. Can you just talk about what that was like? And you were up against a very powerful state attorney, Gordon Oldham, and you're this young lawyer, and he probably doesn't have a lot of great respect for you because you're from the outside.
Right.
What was it like just dealing with that in Lake County? This is his home turf.
Dealing with Gordon Oldham, it was always a bad scene for me. He acted like, I was 28 years old. He didn't know anything, and he may have been right, but he wasn't at all courteous. But the main thing beyond that is the way he and the sheriff, all of them lost all their records on the Jesse Daniels case, coincidentally.
Right.
Yeah. And so we couldn't get any information from them. Discovery is very important in a criminal case where you go in and find what have they got. We didn't get it from either one of them. We knew there was a confession. We knew it existed because it was sent by Odom to the chief doctor at Chattahoochee.
Right.
And when we finally got in there to see what they had, the cover letter was there, but not the confession.
Wow.
And McCall was amazing. He couldn't find anything. He couldn't remember anything. He said, well, we moved the office and we could have lost it then or something. I mean, both offices, lose the records.
Yeah, I mean, I was told, I've been trying to get Willis McCall's records for years, and someone just told me, look, there was a big barbecue of all those records. Yeah. They're never going to see the light of day. But on the other hand, you did force them into a hearing, and they had to answer questions under oath.
Right.
And so now you had these deputies basically perjuring themselves and lying about what had happened, which just seemed pretty obvious. And I guess there's another moment, like when you're showing up in these Lake County courthouses, you mentioned it, all the courtrooms that you experienced later on in your life, people took their hats off, but not in the Lake County courthouse.
Right. I was, I had not much experience, but I knew every time I went to watch a trial or be in a trial, someone would come in with a hat on, and the bailiffs would politely say, you need to take that hat off. Not in Lake County, not in Willis.
And I mean, there's one scene that I was writing about the hearing, and the hearing is drawn out, and it looks like everything is going according to plan. You're exposing all this misconduct and everything in the case, and then it comes down to the judge, and the judge has to offer his opinion, and there's Willis McCall staring him down in the courtroom. I mean, what was that like? What was the atmosphere like?
That was amazing because that was the hearing that we were entitled to on whether or not Jesse had regained his, they called it sanity, but basically the ability to understand the charges and help his attorney. We had him brought down by the Volusia County Sheriff because we knew the track record of prisoners driving with McCall. About half of them lived through it.
Right.
And so Ed Duff volunteered. He said, we'll go get him if you get a court order. So I went over and got a court order. I don't even think I told Odom about it. But the hearing was about this sanity issue.
Right.
Okay. So we had Jesse about a week in DeLand at the county jail. And Ted and I brought in psychiatrists, three of them, a PhD psychologist. We brought in cops who knew about interrogation. We had 2 days worth of witnesses. Every one of them said he understands the charges. He can help his attorney. And so Judge Mills heard all that. And then Odom had one witness. It was a doctor who worked at Chattahoochee who had never examined Jesse, but he'd read the charts or the reports. He'd only been seen by doctors 8 times in 13 years at that time, and they admitted that. And so that's what we had, and that's what Odom had. And so Mills says he needs to think about it for an hour, and how hard it is and everything. What's hard about that? All of our
Right.
and so Ted had to go back to DeLand. We brought 2 cars, and so I waited for the verdict, and I saw no way he could do anything but all we asked for was a trial. We didn't ask for a dismissal. And Mills comes in there and gives these flaky reasons that our experts had just seen him for an hour or 2 in the jail, but the experts up in Chattahoochee had been seeing him for 14 years. Well, they didn't see him; he was just there 14 years,
Right.
and so he ruled that he wasn't capable of understanding the charges, and he was going to go back to Chattahoochee for the rest of his life. It looked like. So, of course, that didn't stay long, but
No. But at that point, you must be getting a sense of what's happening in Lake County. And, I don't even know if you were aware of this conspiracy at the time, but it certainly looks like the powers that be in Lake County are working to keep Jesse from having a trial.
Right.
And that could be for a bunch of different reasons. It could be because they don't want the Knowles family answering questions about what was going on.
Right.
There's a lot of different reasons, but I think one of the most telling things that I found was that in order to get a court-appointed attorney for Jesse Daniels early on in that case, they went and found the prior state attorney, who was very good friends with all of them, very good friends with Willis McCall. And the very first thing that A.P. Buey does is basically write a letter to Chattahoochee saying, hold Jesse Daniels indefinitely. Between you and me, my client is guilty. I mean, have you ever seen anything like that?
No, never. That's disbarment stuff.
Right.
For a lawyer to do that to his own client.
And, Jesse Daniels at that point, if you have your own attorney who's supposed to be representing your interests, and he's actually taking the side of the powerful families and the law and the judge and the state attorney and the sheriff himself. I mean,
yeah.
I've never seen anything like this in a courtroom before, where it was that stacked against an innocent person.
Right. And I didn't know this till I read the book, but the meeting that they had the morning after the rape, when Joe Knowles came back into town, Gordon Odom was in the car.
Right.
He's a state attorney, and,
Right.
and that's where they agreed to have a conspiracy to get a white man, because Joe Knowles didn't want it to be a black man.
Right. I mean, that was one of the most strangest documents I've ever seen. Like, it was a real smoking gun. I didn't see it until late into my research. And I remember I got my hands on this document, and there's 6 people in that car, and one of them decides to become an informant because he didn't like what was happening. And he admitted that in that car, they decided that Blanche had to change the race of her attacker in order to make it a white person and to make it Jesse Daniels.
Yeah, and Odom said, I can take care of that.
Right.
I'll handle it.
Right. And if Odom said that, then the sheriff didn't want to go along with this, because this was depriving him a chance to send an African-American to the electric chair.
Yeah.
So he was a little bit like, what are you doing? But then he understood why it had to be done.
Yeah, but he would have had the Klan kill that guy who really did it, probably.
And that was, one of the things we learned later on, is that was part of the deal. They weren't going to let the guilty person go on that.
No,
but
never.
Unfortunately, he struck again. He actually sexually assaulted another white woman in that neighborhood, and now he was in the system. Yeah. Now he was up in Rayford awaiting his own death penalty.
That's Sam Wiley Odom. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Mabel's the only one who really figured that out. She went up and visited him.
Right. And to his credit, I mean, you can't excuse rape, but he was unwilling to let them think Jesse did it. He many times said, I don't know who did it, but I know he didn't.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that was one of the most tragic parts of the story, is that you saw Gordon Oldham manipulating that scene at the very end and trying to convince Sam Wiley Odom that if he admits involvement in another rape, that was the surest way to go to the electric chair. Like, there was no way that the governor was going to consider staying that execution. And so, as sort of a deal with his mother, he decides to deny everything and recants.
Right.
But it was obvious what was happening. And sure enough, it didn't help him anyway.
No. No, again from the book, he was the last person in Florida to ever be executed for a non-homicidal rape. The last one.
Right. And shortly after that, the law changed. But that was a point when Mabel was really distressed because she was convinced that Sam Wiley Odom knew about this case. And of course, Willis McCall and Gordon Oldham had no interest in exploring that any further.
No.
Remarkably, they didn't even see a connection to this sexual assault, within a few miles at the same time. They said, oh no, one was Jesse Daniels, the other one was Sam Wiley Odom.
Right. And even... I think the polygraph guy, and he said that it's likely to be Sam Wiley. I'm not sure he said that, but he said his confession in the name of Jesse. I know we haven't gotten there yet, but there's too much information there that it was just like Blanche's connection.
Right. It was a very similar.
Yeah. So he said he had to either have done it or been there.
Right. And one of the things that made it, he stripped off all his clothes before he went into the house.
Right.
That was kind of his MO, and he did that in both cases. So, it was written down as described.
They said he dropped a wood chip or something like that. Where was it? He got socks on.
That was another one that we were able to learn from the deputy, Evie Griffin, who later came to us and said, I know exactly how they tried to frame him. And he told the story about the other deputy who went and took one of the guitar picks from Jesse's house and put it in Blanche's house. They never had a criminal trial. It didn't make a difference. No. But the fact that he did that was not a surprise.
They had it just in case.
Right. They were all ready for that. And then this is the kind of thing that Lake County Sheriff's Department had been doing for decades.
Right. Well, those cases, that were, you talked about in Devil in the Grove too, there was almost always evidence that was created or hidden, and they had no problem going into someone's house without a warrant.
Right.
And just raiding whatever they wanted.
No, they just did whatever they want. They just fabricated evidence. They really liked in Lake County, for some reason, these footprints. And they always made these plaster cast of footprints that were going to unlock the mysteries of the case. And, they were basically manufacturing the evidence the whole time.
Yeah, that was Yates' specialty, I think.
Yes, it was. There's also something that happened while you're looking into this case. You had one of the things that you told me, and one of the things that a lot of people told me when I started working on this, was that nobody's going to talk to you about this because it involved very powerful people that did not want this story out there. And that was definitely the case. I ran into that. But you also ran into that with one of your law school roommates or friends.
Right. He was one of my best friends in law school. We were in the same class. We graduated together. We had gone down to meet them on the beach, and spent the night together a couple of times after we got out and were practicing. And after, he lived in Lake County. His dad was a doctor there. But after I got involved in the Jesse Daniels case, he has never spoken to me since. We were spending weekends together.
Wow.
And I heard, and I think you showed me, he had become an assistant state attorney working for Odom. Gordon Odom.
He was working for him. So that might have played a role.
Yeah, that's certainly was. His job depended on him not talking to me.
Yeah, that's true. Or he should have, if he was smart, he could have been talking to you the whole time. Figure out where the case is going. So in this particular case, you have your hearing, you're not victorious, but the Second District Court of Appeals overturned it.
Right.
And what did that do to the case at that point?
Well, they not only overturned it, a couple of ways you can, judges can reverse a case. One is to reverse it and say, have another hearing because that one was flawed. They didn't do that. They reversed it with instructions. They said, your judgment is wrong, and we reverse it, and we mandate you to enter a new order saying he is capable of standing trial. He's competent to stand trial. They didn't give Odom a choice to mess it up again.
Right, and so he had what, like 30 days to decide how to go forward?
15.
15 days?
Yeah.
Wow, so it was urgent.
Yeah.
And how did Gordon Oldham react to that decision?
He acted like he didn't know how he was going to do it. You know, he took the whole 15 days.
Of course.
And decided not to do it because that would have been a laugh. You know, take that transcript up to the to the state Supreme Court.
Right, right.
They would have, yeah, he would have gotten himself in some trouble. Should have anyway, long time before that. But so he didn't appeal it, and so, but he wouldn't tell me or anybody else what he was going to do is to deprive us of those 15 days for planning for a trial, because we got the right to a trial. We didn't have a right to anything else.
Right.
So we had to try the case. I was fairly confident we wouldn't have to, but you know, because they'd have to get Blanche on the stand and she'd have to commit perjury, and I don't know that she would have done it.
Right. And that was, I think, they did not want this going to trial
Right.
at that point. So they just took their sweet time. And then would they null pros it at the end?
Yeah,
They did.
Right, close to the end of that year, because Pearl found out about it on New Year's Day, I think.
Oh, is that right?
That next year, yeah. And but that was official. I think he just dropped it. He said, you know, dismissed, but did a formal null pros, you know, pretty soon after that, and he was just hoping that the press wouldn't get it and no one would look into it.
Right. That didn't happen that way.
No.
And he wasn't exactly generous towards Jesse about it.
No.
He basically said I would have an easy time convicting him again if I wanted to, but too much time has passed or something.
Yeah, and he said what intrigued me. He said he didn't know whether he could convict him now. He said I could have convicted him then easy, indicating he's guilty. He said, I don't know how I could do it now because a confession would probably be thrown out and the witnesses would have a hard time. Well, there are only two witnesses to a rape. That's the rapist and the victim. Right. They were both around.
Both alive.
Yeah. And so that, and then in any event, no matter what, he didn't need a confession to convict him if Blanche Knowles would have gotten on the witness stand and said, he did it. I know it.
Right.
Yeah.
So that would have been a fairly easy thing to do. All
Right.
you'd need is really one witness, but apparently that was off the table too.
Yeah, and I thought early on that she would not go on the witness stand and commit perjury. I never thought she would do that.
Right.
That was her husband's idea.
Right. And that sort of showed you about what was happening at the time. It wasn't just this form of racism that permeated this case in a strange way. There's also this misogynistic thing. Like Blanche was now, you know, it's almost like this sexual assault was not an attack on Blanche. It was sort of an attack on Joe Knowles' reputation. And he was the one that spurred this forward. It was never about, wow, we have a victim to a violent or a sexual assault. Let's take care of her. Let's find out if she's okay. It was more like, we need to protect reputations in this society and change some of the evidence, which is kind of preposterous when you look at it.
It is, and I know that back then, and this was also in your book, you researched it, rape was considered more an affront to the husband than it was to the victim.
Right.
Yeah, and for what reason, I will never know.
Right, it was like a violation of a man's property.
Right, yeah, property right.
Yeah.
So I thought they did away with that a long time before.
Yeah. So what ends up happening next is there's not going to be a trial, but you file a claims bill. You file for a claims bill in order to compensate Jesse for pain and suffering and false imprisonment, I guess.
Yeah, well, it had to be based on negligence because it's against, the state pays it.
Right.
Yeah. And so they probably won't pay an intentional thing. They would say, why didn't you prosecute him? It was for negligence. It really was intentional, but for their not knowing and investigating and finding out that he had nothing to do with the crime.
Right.
And he loses 14 years of his life. His father dies while he's there and never saw him as a free person again. His mother spent 23 hours a day probably trying to figure out, writing every governor all the time, writing the president, writing J. Edgar Hoover. You know,
yeah.
She never gave up.
You know, that was probably one of the most heartwarming parts of the whole story was that, you know, this mother who's picking watermelons, dirt poor, she has no resources to defend her son.
Right.
The only thing she really has is her voice. And so she starts writing letters to J. Edgar Hoover himself.
Right.
And I guess she wrote so many that Hoover began to answer her and give her legal advice on the case. And she would write back and say, "You don't understand, Mr. Hoover. They're all corrupt in Lake County. I need outside help. I need this."
Yeah.
And finally, I think she just nagged J. Edgar Hoover so much that he decided to open up a civil rights investigation. Yeah. And that was a real turning point because it unleashed all these investigators into Lake County.
Yeah.
And later on, Thomas Woods, the special master in this case, I think he said something like, because Jesse Daniels never had a trial to determine his guilt, this legislative hearing is going to be about determining whether Jesse Daniels is guilty. So in effect, it became a trial, right?
It really did. I mean, we had several days of testimony. Woods was a very good special magistrate. I mean, he's very thorough. And we put on witnesses, Gordon Oden and McCall. And, you know, and I remember, but it's been a long time. But they just kind of brushed through it. You know, we don't remember, you know, it's been so long. And that kind of thing. And when I asked McCall, I remember this, and you recall it in the book too. Didn't you, or why did you announce to the press that you were looking for a husky black man as the perpetrator in this crime? And he said, the press always misquotes me all the time. And I said, did you ask for a retraction? And he said, no.
Yeah.
So.
Right, and in the original press coverage, that was the suspect. It was in all the headlines.
Well, they rounded up 30 black people who, and just were trying to beat confessions out of as many as they could.
Right, and that was that little town of Okahumpka again. I think they rounded up every black male under 40 and just threw him in jail.
Yeah, they did.
But there was one blockbuster moment in the hearing. One of the witnesses was the court stenographer in Lake County. And, you know, this, I think it sounds like something out of a novel. Again, I could not believe this was real life when I was reading it. But do you remember that moment where the stenographer showed up to talk about taking Jesse Daniels' confession shortly after his arrest?
I do. I sure do. I never forget it. She was on the witness stand, and she had did it at the sheriff's office, and they said Jesse Daniels is ready to confess, and so he's sitting in there. She's taking out, you know, transcript, and he goes through it, and he tells this is where his story was much like Blanche's. You know,
right.
She was talking about. She did the confession, just took it down verbatim, and then she came out, she read it to him, he signed it, and she notarized it.
Right.
Okay, that was her testimony at the hearing.
Right.
And so here I get to cross-examine, and the one thing I wish I did remember, but I don't. I don't know if I knew beforehand what they had done.
Right.
But anyway, I was either lucky or right. But but I asked her. I said I handed her a picture of Jesse Daniels when he was 19 years old. That's, you know, he's been out now. He doesn't look the same.
Right.
And I said, "Can you look at this and see if it changes anything you might have just said?" And she said, "I've never seen this guy in my life." And so then I asked her, "Well, can you describe the guy that gave the confession?" And she said, "Well, he had kinky black hair," and then everybody was going, "Wait a minute." And so the Special Master Woods got everybody out of the room and met with the attorneys, and it was the Special Master couldn't believe what happened.
Right. I think his quote was, "Someone should write a book about this."
It was, yeah. He said he just couldn't believe it.
So she describes that the person who confessed to her is an African American, a
Right.
young African American.
Right.
And she's just, the reality is sunken in that this was the wrong person, and that Deputy James Yates had pulled a fast one on her.
Yep.
And it brought out the actual person who sexually assaulted Blanche and told him to confess using the name of Jesse Daniels.
Right.
And so you guys set up a meeting in a cafe, right?
Yeah, yeah. Mostly the Florida Department of Law Enforcement wanted to do it, and some others, but everybody agreed after she did it that they'd have to do some more investigating and everything and see how it happened. But I mean, it's just. But she and I remember this. She almost collapsed when she figured it out when she and Jesse were sitting across the table from each other.
Right.
And she was smart enough to know who is this guy and why is he here? And then why are all these cops here? So she figured it out. She said, "Is this Jesse Daniels?" And the lawyers all nodded and said, "Yeah." And she just collapsed almost and said it was not. It was a Negro's confession I notarized.
Right. And she said, I swear I remember this because she had gone to school with Blanche.
Right.
And so she remembered the case. And she remembered very clearly that an African American handed her and signed a confession and she notarized it. And,
Right.
I mean, in fact, I think that was one of the most interesting parts of, and I would talk about this a little bit, about working together, trying to get to the bottom of this case. And I remember, I think I showed you some drafts early on, and I said, does this scene sort of describe what happened in that cafe? And you were very polite, but you said, no, it was much more dramatic than you have it. She collapsed. She had realized that she had played a small and inadvertent role of sending Jesse Daniels away. Clearly, she was duped in this situation, but you really described the agony that she was feeling when she realized this.
Her legs were wobbly. She almost... she was not crying, but she was kind of hysterical. And she said, it was a black man that I took a confession from it, and the black man who signed it. And the polygraph guy got fooled the same way. I mean,
right. They did the same thing to the polygraph expert.
Now, these are your elected law enforcement people putting fake defendants in there to lie in the name of the accused.
Right.
And for them to not go to prison for that is something I will never get over.
And I think that was part of the hearing, that it seemed pretty obvious. I know that Special Master Woods had access to the grand jury records, which is really unusual to release those.
It is.
Because they're usually supposed to be secret. But Special Master Woods, he really wanted the whole record. And I think at the end, after he'd heard everything, he was just absolutely convinced that Jesse Daniels was innocent.
He was.
And he was wrongly accused. He was on the part of the state. And so that must have been a great moment, because you finally had this result, even though it didn't happen in a criminal trial.
Right.
It happened in the legislature.
Right. And it was a complete exoneration. I mean, the legislature, as bad as some of that went, claim bills are always bad in the legislature. I was there for 4 years. And I put a number on the claim bill that I gave to Woods that I had filed by our local representatives and Fred Carl. I asked for like $112,000 or $122,000 for him as $1 an hour for while he was missed work while he was there. I didn't know anything about what it would be worth, and I wanted it to pass because they wanted the Declaration of Innocence more than they wanted money.
Right, right.
And they got it. But the Woods, as special master, after the hearing, he said, "I'm going to raise this from $122,000 to $200,000 for Jesse."
He nearly doubled it.
Yeah, pretty much.
And
that doesn't happen very much in the Florida legislature.
clearly there was still some resistance, especially the Lake County
Right.
legislators who decided to argue about it and reduce the amount.
Right.
And that was a particularly distasteful thing, I think,
Right.
when I was reading that. Let's talk about some of the good things that happened from Jesse's case. It caught the attention of a legislator down in South Florida, Maxine Baker.
Right.
And can you talk about the aftermath of Jesse Daniels and how Maxine Baker became involved?
She was chairman of the subcommittee on mental health and maybe retardation. I'm not sure how the committee was named exactly, but that was her deal. And she knew how bad it was. She followed Jesse's case, and she followed another case, and you'll probably remember the name of the guy in Chattahoochee that they kept him without a court order even.
Right, O'Donnell.
Yeah. She followed those and was just shocked by the lack of the rights that were respected.
Right.
And so she set out to rewrite the mental health laws, which had not been touched for about 100 years.
Unbelievable.
And so she called me and asked me to come up and write it. And I did, and they kept changing it, so I had to go up about 3 times. But finally it got passed as the Baker Act. And it's, when I was a judge, I handled a lot of Baker Acts. I volunteered to do it. And it's really, there's so much due process you can't believe. It's you're going to see a judge. A judge usually has to sign for them even to take you to a center like Halifax Hospital here, where they have an insanity ward or whatever, and they can only hold you for 72 hours before you go to a hearing before a judge. Or if you don't have a lawyer, they give you a lawyer.
Right.
And you got a judge who knows what the Baker Act is, and so it's been a big improvement. A lot of states have adopted it, just like the one that we have.
Right. Right. The Baker Act is the one that sort of fueled all the other states, and they modeled it after what Florida was doing, which is pretty impressive. And to think that this little kid from Okahumpka has and you too, has a hand in this. One of the things I learned, I think after I wrote this book, I was talking to Sandy Dallenbert, and we're talking about the Baker Act, and he was there for it, and he said, I had a young assistant who worked with Maxine Baker, and she helped shepherd the bill through, and she was very smart. He said her name was Janet Reno.
Right. I remember, because I went up there to the hearings, and I met both of them several times. And no one had heard much of Janet Reno back then, but Dallenbert was always a well-known guy.
Right, right.
Everybody liked him, and he was very powerful in the legislature.
What do you think the lasting impact of this case is? You've talked about what this case meant to you personally. What did it mean? What does it mean to you?
Well, it was probably the biggest case I ever handled, because it did change the law, and hopefully that what happened to Jesse will never happen to anybody in Florida again. And although I didn't succeed in putting those guys behind bars, that wasn't my job.
Right.
But I disagreed with the people who refused to prosecute him, because they would say, well, it's 15 years ago, statute of limitations is run. And my position was the statute didn't start to run until he got out, because it was a continuing conspiracy.
I agree.
And but the U.S. attorney didn't buy that, I guess, and for some reason they didn't prosecute him, and that's really none of my business, But it was my desire to have those guys pay for some of this stuff.
Yeah, it's really definitely seemed when I was looking at why there was no follow-up. I think Gordon Oldham was pretty young and popular, and I think there might have been some friends in high places that were looking out for him. There definitely were from Lake County, and they were fighting to reduce the claims bill. Right. So there were still people that had his back in there.
Yeah, can you imagine having, doing things that resulted in a false imprisonment for 14 years, destroying a family, and then killing the claim bill for Pearl, his mother.
Right.
They killed that one.
Right.
And then they cut Jesse's from $200,000 to $75,000. And that was Gordon Odom, standing outside the House chamber. He couldn't go in, or he would have.
Right.
And feeding instructions and arguments to defeat the bill to the Lake County delegation to present. You would think they would join in on the bill once it's
right.
It's shown that they wouldn't, because it was intentional. So they had to get around that. But on the Judge Scott claim, I think, this is going back a while in our conversation. He was a federal judge out of Jacksonville. I knew him, but not just as a young lawyer. Right. I had a couple of things with him. And Bunny's dad, I think, knew him pretty well. He was in Jacksonville, and they played golf or something.
Oh, yeah.
But he was a good judge.
Oh, yeah.
And he handled some of the Fruitland case, I think, didn't he?
He did, and so he was very well aware of Lake County's reputation. And he was the one that ordered the grand jury transcripts be revealed to the legislature, which was unusual.
And I saw either the order, I think that's probably what it was. It said, it looks like a terrible miscarriage of justice has occurred, and the victim is Jesse Daniels. And so it's in the public's interest. Grand jury transcripts are very confidential, but he allowed Tom Woods, so he could know what to do with the claim bill.
Right.
To read the transcript, but he couldn't tell anybody what's in it.
Right.
But that's what changed him. He was he confessed he had to do it for about a year.
Really?
And then when he read that transcript, he said he did not do it. It was a horrible conspiracy, and that's, when he came around, that's why he doubled what I asked for.
Yeah, I mean, and it's pretty obvious too, because Sheriff Willis McCall at this point, he pulls a gun on Jesse Daniels,
right,
and gets him to confess.
Right.
And he's done that before. I went through his whole record. He's done that many times. I think it's almost hard to believe people just don't expect the sheriff to do something like that.
Right. And they have a deputy behind him vising his neck.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and saying it was already typed up. And,
right.
And he said, can I read it, or it's none of your business?
Yeah, none of your
confession.
business. Right. And then this was just, one of the things that I think Willis McCall was sort of known for. I remember going into Lake County to do a lot of research, and one of the things that struck me was that white people would tell me, we were terrified of him too. If you were on the wrong side of him, it didn't matter what color you were. You had to be either for the sheriff or against the sheriff. And I think that's what you see played out between Jesse Daniels, Mabel, all these people run out of town.
Right.
Lawyers who try to defend them are getting, this oppression and this intimidation from Lake County law enforcement.
Right.
Not an easy place to be.
I mean, even Judge Mills, my father knew him, and they worked together on the clients, Greyhound bus lines and some other things. But so I'd met him a couple of times, and he was a good lawyer and a nice guy, but he couldn't stand up to him.
Right. And what do you think that would have been like for him to stand up to Willis McCall? I mean,
he would not have been elected. He had an election coming up. I hope that's the worst they would have done, but they've done at least that.
Right, and he was smart enough to know that
right.
Because you could feel that Willis McCall was leaning on him,
right,
and Gordon Oldham at the time that he was to make that decision. And the decision really didn't make any sense. If you've read the evidence and you sat through that hearing, it was pretty obvious the direction that case needed to go. And yet...
there was, like the appellate court said, when the evidence is so contrary to the ruling of the court, we have a duty to reverse. I mean, there was nothing in there that indicated that he couldn't stand trial, except one guy who never looked at him, never examined him.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the other parts of the case was, when people were telling me nobody's going to talk to you about this, and you experienced that, losing, a friend to this
Yeah.
case. I think it really speaks to the powers of this quarterback club, which you write about in there. And, you had the judge, 2 state attorneys, the sheriff is in it, Joe Knowles is in it, all these powerful people in Lake County, and they are really engineering this conspiracy.
Right.
And I think I was really skeptical about a conspiracy because when I started looking into this, I'm never going to be able to prove this. It's going to be really dicey to insinuate that this happens. And then I see it in this FBI document when one of them turns
Right.
on the others. So I think, sometimes we look at conspiracies and, we think, oh, these just are so far-fetched. If a conspiracy really existed, somewhere along the line, it would fall apart. That's
Right.
exactly what happened in
Right.
this case.
Right.
One person made it fall apart.
So he's the one that's, it was too much for him
It was.
to
He
put
said
a retarded guy
right.
behind bars.
I think he later said, I went in to talk to Willis McCall about this, and McCall just threw him out of the office.
Right.
Like it's too late for that. We understand that you're not happy with this. But then, when an investigator came in and started asking him, he was nervous, but he said, I'll tell you what happened. And he described this conspiracy in the car, which was a huge turning point in the whole case. Really exposing this level of corruption.
Yeah.
These are elected officials for the
Yeah.
most part.
And he even said, as I recall, that if he can get one of the other 5 to verify it, he'd
Right.
come out with it and take his chance with Odom and those guys. But he doesn't want to let out if it's not going anywhere.
Right.
And you got to have 2 to have a conspiracy.
Exactly. And I think that's probably why it made it to the grand jury, but I don't think any of the other men were likely to turn on and reveal
Right.
it. And so that's why there were no charges filed, I
Right.
think. But again, I think the legislature is the one that did the job, and they determined that Jesse Daniels was totally innocent
Right.
and exonerated him, which is, how the state was able to at least compensate him, not as much as everyone had hoped, but something for his trouble.
And he, I think Governor Askew signed the bill, may have even had a event for it.
Right.
I was out of town, but usually the governors just let them become law, particularly
Right.
claim bills without signing them. But I think he signed this one. And it was a big coincidence when he got elected. First place, he hated racism and the behavior that's over there in Lake County. But secondly, Ted Husfeld and he were friends because they both had adopted children and both sat on the board of the Children's Home Society for years. And so they really knew each other. So Ted had total access to him. So did Mabel, developed it too.
Right. Mabel was writing a lot of letters too.
Right.
And I think at that point, you sort of began to see a turning of the tide in Lake County. Shortly after Jesse Daniels was released, Willis McCall beat to death a black mentally disabled prisoner in a cell in Lake County. And that caused Askew to suspend him from office.
Right.
And he was indicted and he was brought up on murder charges. And that was kind of the end of Willis McCall's reign. It was 28 years long,
Right.
1972. It was amazing he made it that far.
Absolutely.
But that was a turning of the tide. And that's when I think a lot of people in Lake County began to speak out because they saw that Willis McCall might be coming out of power now.
Yeah. But even then, I guess, he was charged with second-degree murder, and the facts were just so clear. But McCall got some of the trustees at the jail to lie about it.
Right.
And then one of the jurors was questioned and said, we're afraid of him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that was one of the things I found, like talking to the FDLE agents who went in and interviewed the jurors afterwards. And they said, well, we thought he was guilty, but we got to live down here.
Yeah,
I mean, that
right.
just showed you the power.
Yeah.
And, I didn't get too much into this in the book because it's another case entirely. But in the middle of the case, one of the witnesses against Willis McCall disappears. They can't find him.
Yeah.
And then another one has his head blown off outside a tavern
Right.
in Lake County. And so, there's definitely no connection to Willis McCall that anyone could really find. But what are the odds? I mean, Willis McCall was head of the Klan in Lake County.
And why would someone come up and put a shotgun in a witness's face and kill him when they didn't even know him?
Right.
They didn't rob him either.
Right.
So
there were a lot of these things happening in Lake County. And Jesse's story is, probably one of the most disturbing stories, because it shows you the length that people were willing to go in order to protect the reputation and of these society folks in Lake County. The powerful people just could not bear this kind of scandal.
Right.
And so it just showed you like the level of corruption that existed, that they could just influence the criminal justice system so perversely.
It's amazing.
And do you remember Jesse Daniels, after nearly 14 years at Chattahoochee, he's finally released? I think you were the one that sent the policeman up there to pick him up.
Right.
What was that like when you finally realized he was getting out after all these years?
Oh, it was just amazing, because we had Gordon Odom boxed in. He had to do something in 15 days. He knew he couldn't try him.
Right.
Yeah, and so that was a lot of satisfaction for me, watching him squirm.
Yeah. Yeah, and I frankly don't even understand why they fought it as much as they did. It could have been probably handled even more quietly.
Yeah. Now, why not just say, okay, he served more time than he would have if he'd been convicted
Right.
and pardoned, not pardoned, but gotten parole. But that would have been the easy way for Odom to get out of
Right.
it. He just couldn't do it.
Right, and what would have been the downside of having Jesse Daniels free and living in Daytona? He would have been out of Lake County. The story never would have come up again.
Right.
But the fact that they fought so hard and had to resort to further corruption only made it more intense.
Yeah, and even when he did dismiss the case, he said, well, I think he was guilty. I would have convicted him. That's a cheap shot when you don't have the guts to try him. And then you say you would have convicted him.
One of my favorite quotes in the book was you talking about, Willis McCall was always seen as like the devil of Lake County, the most powerful force in Lake County. But you actually said something about Gordon Oldham being the most dangerous person in Lake County. And can you just talk about why?
Well, because the state attorney has so much power, so much discretion. They can file a charge against anybody they want to. They can dismiss a charge against one of their buddies. A guy like McCall is dangerous just because he's brutal, he's stupid, and he's a racist. But Odom was smart, and he had a job that had tremendous power. And I remember saying that because reporters were asking me right after Odom organized the defeat of the claim bill for Pearl and the reduction of Jesse's, and they were talking about Willis McCall. I said, don't blame it all on him. The main culprit in this case is Gordon Odom, because any decent state attorney would have seen the light and processed him immediately.
And you make no bones about it, even though you were the legal force that really turned this case around. Without you, I don't think this ever would have happened. But you were very quick to point out Mabel's role in this entire case. And can you just talk about that a little bit?
Well, it wouldn't have happened without Mabel. He'd been in Chattahoochee for 12 years when Pearl came to see me the first time I ever knew the case. But she'd been working on it for that from day one. She's the real hero because they were burning crosses in her yard. They poisoned her dog. This is while she was in Lake County. They did dynamite, I think, and shooting through her house and ran her out. Put a competitor right across the street with a little paper when the town could barely support one to run her out of business too. None of that happened to me. So I say she gets the hero's role.
Well, I think it was a great combination of journalism and the law that combined to really seek justice and win justice in this case. And I don't think it could have happened without either of you on this side. And I know that we were fortunate enough to have a nice meeting with Jesse Daniels.
Yeah.
Later on, and you hadn't seen him in a while, right?
Right.
You were living in Ormond Beach, and he was in Daytona, but he was working odd jobs, side jobs, and things like that.
Right. Yeah. For a while I saw him when I was practicing law, and I had an office down there near the Mental Health Association building, right? In fact, I gave him the building. But he would be there a lot because the mental health people of all descriptions could go there, and it's I can't remember exactly what they call it. It's just a place to gather and talk, and they'd, give them some food if they needed it, and things like that. But he would go down there on his bicycle, and when I'd see he right next door, so I'd see him a lot and go out and talk to him, and he'd come in and see me. And but that, for some reason, well, maybe it's because I got a different job, didn't have that building anymore, but I didn't see him much after that.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he was still riding his bicycle around town, and
Right.
just like he was in Okahumpka as a little kid. Even everybody knew him in Okahumpka as the boy on the bike.
Right.
And I have pictures of him as a grown adult riding his bike around Daytona Beach, which is
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah,
And his mom later passed away.
Yeah.
So he was, you don't like to use the word orphaned with an adult, but in a way, he was very dependent on his mother for his life. And
Yeah, he was, and fortunately, someone found him, and who I'm talking about, Reverend
David
Toxford.
at the church.
Yeah,
And that saved his life. I mean,
It did.
He was wandering around, and there wasn't really. I think he'd kind of burned through the money, not out of spending it, but
No.
it just doesn't last that long. And
No.
we're talking about 40 years with $75,000.
we put it in a trust for him because we knew he didn't know how to handle money that well.
Right.
So, but it did run out eventually.
Yeah.
And I think that made him qualify for some federal or state grants or something. And so, but there's nothing like the care and companionship that he got from David Troxler.
Right.
And and Jesse never got in any trouble or never had any problems after he went in. Troxler picked him up and took care of him.
Right. And he was part of a community. He was very involved with the church. And,
Right.
And even right up until the very end, I think David was making sure that he had the right kind of medical care, because he started having vision and hearing problems and all sorts of health problems. But I mean, his life was, for the most part, taken away from him.
Right.
I mean, that was one of the things when you talk to him, that he felt like, even though he was 18 or 19 when he went in, he felt like it was his childhood, because all the doctors said that, yeah, he was a 19-year-old kid, but he had the mind of a 10-year-old, and his life was sort of, the things he got involved in were things that pre-adolescents were doing, going to the fishing hole, riding his bike around town.
Right.
And so he felt that he was robbed of his childhood, even though he was 19 years old.
Yeah, he was robbed of some valuable years of his life, for sure of that, and for no reason except corruption.
Right. Can you just talk about what it was like in the aftermath, knowing that you have this case? This was a victory for you. You got an innocent person out of Chattahoochee who probably would have, I mean, even the claims bill said he would have spent the rest of his life at Chattahoochee if it wasn't for this intervention. Can you just talk about how your career progressed after that? I mean, I know you didn't talk about this case very much, but what did it teach you about the law and the power of law?
So when I got to be a judge, then it was very important to me, particularly when I was in a family division for about 4 years, and a lot of them didn't have lawyers, and so you got to treat them gently. You got to be nice to them. You got to, hear their story, and some judges just never catch on to that. Yeah.
Right.
But it taught me a lot of humility and everything, and it also a lot of pride, because I got a case in the Supreme Court of the United States. Most lawyers don't get that opportunity.
Yeah.
And we changed the mental health laws.
Right.
And that Jesse's case did that.
Right. And these laws are still on the books today. The Baker Act is still in place. And it obviously there's some amendments that are happening, and the Baker Act is constantly looked at for ways to improve it. But I think for what it did for people like Jesse Daniels, who really didn't have any rights before the Baker Act,
Right.
he didn't have the right to a trial.
I mean, there's supposed to be a presumption of innocence in this country, and that violates it horribly.
Right.
And so the Baker Act changes it. You have to not only, it doesn't matter if you're charged with a crime or not, but if someone files a Baker Act, you probably did something criminal or were alleged to have done something criminal, but even if there are no charges, you have to show that the person has a mental illness, and because of that mental illness, he or she is dangerous to himself, herself, or others because of the mental illness. But under the previous law, if you're charged with a crime and you can't help your lawyer, you're gone.
Right.
Whether you're dangerous, we had all kinds of findings in the case that we had a hearing on with all those psychiatrists and everything. Everybody said he wasn't dangerous to himself or anybody else. In fact, the head of the Chattahoochee said it. He's certified. He's not dangerous to anybody.
Right.
And everybody who ever looked at him said he is too timid. He does not have any possibility of having raped anybody.
That to me is probably the most disturbing part of the story, was that in the psychiatrist evaluations of Jesse Daniels, they all say exactly what you said. He doesn't pose any danger or any risk within the institution. He doesn't appear to be violent at all. He's very docile, very cooperative. They said the only thing really keeping him here is that he lingers under the impression that he's been framed by the sheriff for a crime he didn't commit, when his own lawyer said he was guilty.
Yeah.
And so that's what's keeping him in Chattahoochee for all those years. I mean,
and they had the confession that was signed by a black man, and they had the Sam Bowie's letter saying that he's the man, he did it.
Right.
His own lawyer. And so when Jesse said, "I didn't do it. I'm innocent. I've been here a long time and I didn't do anything wrong," and that was classified as delusional.
Right.
And that's probably why they kept him.
Right. He got delusional into his record.
Right. But no psychotic behavior, no bad behavior.
Right. But well, I mean, I think in Jesse's case, there was a lot of dark spots. I had the pleasure of interviewing him several times.
Right.
And, one of the things he never really wanted to talk about were the things that happened at Chattahoochee. Right. And I imagine that was because this place was poorly supervised, and he was thrown into the place that held the ward that held the most violent criminals and the ones who were being evaluated for the most, psychotic crimes.
Right.
And now they're thrown in with Jesse. They can never see the light of day until their case is resolved. And, you had these attendants at Chattahoochee who were sort of famous for turning their back on trouble.
Right.
And not really interacting at all. So there's really no telling what happened to Jesse. He didn't want to talk about it.
No, he didn't.
David Troxler, who with the church, who was handling him, sort of acknowledged that he was not, as a 19-year-old kid, he was not really able to defend himself, and there's no real telling what had happened to him in there. But clearly, there was a reason. He said every day he'd wake up, he wanted to be dead.
Right. Yeah, it was a horrible place. I mean, and to charge him with, put him in the criminal ward. Well, he wasn't a criminal. He had a charge against him.
Right.
And all you got to do is talk to him for a half hour, and he couldn't have raped anybody.
Right. Yeah, and then that was the thing. I mean, and I think during the research, not everything is documented. I definitely didn't have police records to look at, but I started knocking on doors in that neighborhood, and I found a man who lived there back in the day, since the 40s, and he went on to tell me a story that Jesse Daniels was not the first person they tried to frame for this crime. The first person they tried to frame was the exact next door neighbor, who was this eccentric bachelor uncle who came down to care for the citrus holdings in this community. And when they found out that he was eccentric, he was not married, they perceived him as being an outsider and sort of an eccentric in the community. And the first thing they did was claim his shoes to make footprints. And so he knew where that case was going.
Oh, yeah.
But unfortunately,
they're going to match the
exactly,
rape scene.
Exactly. But he had money. He was a dentist, and he was a retired dentist. He had saved some money, and his lawyer was on the board of the same bank that the Knowles family was on. So he was able to get some legal help that Jesse Daniels was not able to get until much later. So it sort of gave you an indication of what was happening in Lake County. They were looking for vulnerable people, disposable people, people who didn't matter in a certain extent. And Jesse Daniels certainly fit that bill. They just rationalized it.
Right. Yeah, they were looking for someone, a helpless white person who could not defend himself.
Right. And Jesse Daniels passed away, I think it was 2018.
Yeah, I think in July. It's been about a year, I think.
Right. And you and I attended the memorial service at the church, and a lot of members of the community showed up. It was kind of a beautiful, I think, ceremony.
It was.
And Jesse Daniels was cremated, and he was buried next to his mother and father out in Center Hill.
Yeah.
So back home at last, I guess, with his parents.
Yeah, I'm sure it was very tough. The period between his mother dying, his father's already dead, and Reverend Troxler picked him up as a ward, really. That was an awful period, I would think. Going place to place and getting work here and there, and
right.
And his trust fund ran out, and so it was that. But right before he died, he was quoted as saying, "I guess I've had a lucky life so far. I mean, after being locked up for 14 years in a hellhole." Yeah,
I think one of his quotes was, "I've had a pretty good life so far."
Yeah,
that was at the age of 78. He was saying that. So.